scorer in the league, and we get no call.
A single swing of the fist, a mere fraction of a second, and suddenly Todd Bertuzzi was staring down the barrel of serious prison time. This wasn't just about ending another man's playing days over what the rulebook called a clean by the book check on the ice. Bertuzzi ripped the lid off a dark, ugly side of professional hockey that the league desperately tried to keep hidden from the public eye. However, flashback exactly 3 years prior to that catastrophic night, and the big forward wasn't standing in a courtroom as a criminal defendant. He was an absolute superstar in the prime of his career, standing a massive 6'3" and tipping the scales at 245 pounds of pure muscle. During the 2002-2003 campaign, he had rightfully earned a spot as a first-team All-Star. That is quite literally the most prestigious individual honor the sport can hand a skater without actually handing him a piece of hardware. He was exactly the type of power forward that gave opposing defensemen absolute nightmares. He possessed hands soft enough to put the puck in the back of the net, yet he was built like a freight train, ready to completely obliterate anyone foolish enough to step into his path. The Vancouver franchise had forged their entire rugged, terrifying identity around his massive frame, and the local fan base worshipped the ice he skated on. Despite all that star power, Bertuzzi wasn't actually the main focal point of that specific roster. Instead, he acted as the ultimate lethal enforcer riding shotgun right next to the team's true crown jewel. That man was Marcus Naslund, the undisputed captain of the squad, and the absolute top scorer across the entire league as they marched into February of 2004. Boasting a staggering 30 goals and 68 points, Naslund was also the guy sharing the ice with Bertuzzi on the very same line. While the captain brought the smooth highlight reel finesse and elite playmaking ability, Big Bert delivered the brutal physical consequences to any opponent who even entertained the thought of taking cheap liberties with his line mate. That classic 1-2 punch of elite skill and sheer physical dominance had transformed the team into an absolute juggernaut out in the Western Conference. And the 2003-2004 season was perfectly lining up to be their ultimate window to prove to the hockey world that they could actually get the job done when the grueling playoffs finally rolled around. Add in the fact that Bertuzzi was skating straight into a massive contract negotiation year, which meant every single time he hopped over the boards, millions of dollars were literally on the line right alongside the team's Stanley Cup aspirations. But what those shiny regular season standings completely failed to capture was the absolute boiling point brewing behind the closed doors of their dressing room. This specific group of guys had cultivated an old-school blood brother culture completely centered on going to war for one another at all costs. The men standing behind the bench did absolutely nothing to pump the brakes on that aggressive vigilante mindset. In fact, they were about to throw gasoline on the fire. So when a direct challenge to their brotherhood skated into their lives wearing the sweater of a 25-year-old rookie forward for the Colorado Avalanche named Steve Moore, the terrifying retaliation that eventually went down wasn't some heat-of-the-moment accident. It was a calculated storm of vengeance that had been brewing in the background for several long, agonizing weeks. And the craziest part, the guy who likely struck the match that ignited the entire powder keg didn't even wear skates. CTA, like and subscribe. Before we go any further, if you are into the kind of raw, unfiltered sports stories that the major networks refuse to touch, smash that like button right now and hit subscribe so you never miss a single one. This channel is built for true fans who want the real story. Now let's get back into it. Let's rewind to the 16th of February 2004 when the Vancouver squad flew out to the Mile High City for a heavyweight clash against Colorado inside the Pepsi Center. At the time, Steve Moore was just a 25-year-old kid trying to survive his first full grind of a season. He was an energy guy, a grinder completely miles away from superstar status. He was exactly the breed of professional who kept his job by doing all the gritty, thankless, bone-crunching, dirty work that never translates into fantasy hockey points. But the single action he took on that specific night in Denver would end up haunting him until his dying breath. Right in the middle of the second frame, Moore lined up a massive open ice check on Naslund just as the Vancouver captain stretched out to corral a loose puck, cutting through the neutral zone, driving his shoulder and elbow aggressively upward toward the superstar's helmet. Naslund crumpled to the frozen sheet in an absolutely devastating heap. Veteran official Dan Maruelli was staring right at the collision from just a few feet away, but he kept his whistle in his pocket, signaling absolutely no penalty on the play. The league's disciplinary front office put the tape under the microscope the very next morning and completely backed up the referee's non-call. In their eyes, it was a perfectly legal hockey play, 0 suspension, and not even a slap on the wrist fine. According to the black and white rulebook of the era, the young Avalanche grinder was completely innocent of any wrongdoing. Meanwhile, Naslund was left picking up the pieces, suffering from a severe concussion and dealing with a painful chipped bone in his elbow joint. The injury sidelined the star captain for the following 3 consecutive matchups. Now for the Vancouver squad, having the premier point producer in the entire sport knocked out of the lineup for any duration was a massive blow to their campaign all by itself. However, it was the absolute venom spilling out of that dressing room over the ensuing days that transformed a tough hockey collision into a terrifying, bloodthirsty manhunt. Vancouver's bench boss, Mark Crawford, wasted absolutely 0 time jumping in front of the microphones, and he was definitely not there to peacefully accept the league's resolution. Instead, he aggressively demanded that the officials start putting some respect on his top scorer's name, completely spinning the lack of a penalty into a catastrophic failure by the league itself, rather than just a fair interpretation of the rules. He blasted it as a gutless, dirty, cheap shot, executed by some unproven rookie against the most highly respected point producer in the entire game, and he was absolutely outraged that no whistle was blown. That fiery public meltdown officially set the violent, unforgiving tone for everything that was about to unfold. But the reaction from the guys actually wearing the sweaters that escalated things to a much darker, far more dangerous level. Vancouver Canucks enforcer Brad May stepped up to the microphones and outright told the press that there was, quote, definitely going to be a massive bounty placed right on Moore's head. Meanwhile, star forward Todd Bertuzzi did not hold back publicly, labeling Moore an absolute piece of garbage. Those toxic remarks spread like wildfire across the sports world, and he followed them up with a chilling warning that should have forced the front office to step in, immediately stating that future matchups would happen and the right opportunity to strike would inevitably present itself. The schedule dictated that these 2 bitter rivals would face off exactly one more time before that fateful night of March 8th. When the puck dropped on March 3rd, NHL Commissioner Gary Bettman was sitting right there in the stands in Vancouver to watch the tension unfold as the contest ended in a deadlocked 5-5 tie. Exactly 5 days after that, the 2 squads collided once again. Only this time around, the league's top brass was nowhere to be found in the arena, and absolutely nothing was standing in the way to keep a lid on the explosive rage that had been boiling over for the past 3 grueling weeks of non-stop bad blood. You have to understand, when a head coach and his entire roster stand in front of cameras promising severe payback for a hit that completely crosses the line from typical hockey bravado into something else entirely. It transforms into a crystal clear team-sanctioned hit job, leaving everyone wondering exactly which player is going to be the one to pull the trigger. The date was March 8th, 2004. The Colorado Avalanche rolled into General Motors Place to take on the Vancouver Canucks. From the cheap seats to the glass, every single fan in that packed arena could feel the heavy anticipation, knowing full well that a brutal payback was on the menu. The only real mystery was what period it would happen in. Even the big wigs at NHL headquarters were fully aware of the ticking time bomb. The Avalanche came out swinging offensively, jumping to a massive 5-0 lead, as the buzzer sounded to signal the end of the first period and kick off the initial intermission, with Colorado already completely blowing out the home team with that insurmountable 5-0 advantage. The NHL's executive vice president Colin Campbell, alongside the director of officiating Andy Van Hellemond, actually picked up the phone to directly contact the on-ice referees, giving them a stern heads up that this blowout was about to turn into an absolute bloodbath. Think about that for a second. The absolute highest authority figures in professional hockey were making frantic mid-game phone calls to desperately warn their own refs about the impending violence that was staring everyone right in the face. The organization at the top knew exactly how dangerous the ice was that night, yet they completely failed to take any real preemptive action to shut the chaos down before it started. Earlier in that very same first period, Steve Moore had actually dropped the gloves and went toe-to-toe with Canucks enforcer Matt Cook, heading to the penalty box to sit out his 5-minute major. According to the unwritten old-school code that governs the sport, that square off should have officially wiped the slate clean and settled the score. The unspoken rules of the ice have always been incredibly straightforward. You answer the bell, you take your lumps like a man, and the beef is completely squashed. Moore had stepped up and paid his dues exactly as expected, so the absolute nightmare that unfolded later in the evening had absolutely nothing to do with enforcing any kind of honorable hockey justice. The Vancouver bench simply refused to let it go, entirely unsatisfied by that initial bout. Several different guys in Canucks sweaters spent the rest of the evening relentlessly hunting Moore down, trying to goad him into another scrap. But Moore just kept his head down and flat out refused every single invitation to drop the gloves a second time. Fast forward to the third period, with Colorado completely dismantling Vancouver by a score of 8-2. The outcome of the actual hockey match had been locked in for what felt like an eternity. That is when Todd Bertuzzi is tapped on the shoulder and sent over the boards. He proceeds to shadow Moore's every move, ominously stalking him all the way down the ice and right back up again, like a predator hunting its prey. This was not two guys mutually squaring up for a fight. This was a chilling one-sided pursuit, and every single television lens in that packed stadium was broadcasting the horrifying sequence live in high definition. Bertuzzi aggressively latches onto the back of Moore's jersey, desperately trying to spin him around, but the Avalanche rookie refuses to take the bait and just keeps skating forward, completely ignoring the aggressive tug. Out of absolutely nowhere, Bertuzzi delivers a devastating blindside sucker punch directly to the side of Moore's head. The lights go out instantly. Moore is knocked completely unconscious before gravity even pulls him down to the frozen playing surface. He crashes face first straight into the unforgiving ice, as Bertuzzi's entire 240+ pound frame violently collapses right on top of his neck and back, driving him forcefully into the rink. In the chaotic scramble that immediately follows, Canucks center Sean Pronger and Avalanche forward Andrei Nikolitin end up jumping into the fray, creating a massive suffocating dog pile right on top of the helpless player. When the bodies are finally cleared away, Moore is lying there completely motionless, unresponsive to the world around him. The frantic athletic trainers and emergency medical technicians sprint out onto the ice in a heartbeat, but they quickly realize the terrifying severity of the situation and refuse to move him an inch. He stays frozen on that exact spot for 10 agonizing minutes. Now hockey is a vicious blue-collar game where tough guys constantly shake off brutal collisions that would easily send an average person straight to the emergency room. But everyone in the building could instantly feel that this was a catastrophic tragedy. The paramedics roll out the stretcher to carefully cart him off. The devastating medical report later revealed fractured vertebrae at the C3 and C4 sections of his neck, alongside a severe grade 3 concussion and incredibly deep gashes across his face that demanded a significant number of stitches just to close up. Miraculously, there was no severing of the spinal cord, but the razor-thin margin between the horrible reality of what actually occurred and permanent lifelong paralysis was nothing short of a millimeter. Bertuzzi was immediately ejected from the matchup, and within hours, the league's front office slapped him with an indefinite suspension pending a full-scale investigation. Furthermore, the National Hockey League dropped the hammer on the Vancouver Canucks franchise as a whole, issuing a hefty penalty of $250,000 against the club. However, as the massive legal battles dragged on and the sheer scale of the ruined career became fully apparent, that financial penalty would eventually look like laughably cheap pocket change by the time this dark chapter officially closed. A mere 48 hours after the tragic incident on the morning of March 10th, a clearly shaken Todd Bertuzzi stepped up to a podium lined with a sea of flashing cameras back inside General Motors Place to deliver a highly anticipated public statement. The massive power forward choked up and had to pause his prepared remarks over and over again, completely overcome with emotion and visibly struggling to force the words out of his mouth. Fighting back tears, he looked out at the massive press corps and delivered a somber, halting plea stating that he simply wanted to apologize from the absolute bottom of his heart for the devastating disaster that took place out there on the ice. I never went out there looking to injure anyone, and knowing how things played out just eats me up inside. He kept his eyes locked on absolutely nothing, staring straight ahead. He threw in an apology directed right at the younger generation watching the sport, claiming genuine remorse. He insisted that causing serious harm simply was not part of his game, declaring that he had never laced up his skates to play that kind of hockey. He desperately tried to paint himself as a decent guy, swearing up and down that he simply did not have a malicious bone in his entire body. He He finished by apologizing once again for the entire catastrophic mess. However, while apologies are quick, the wheels of the actual justice system were grinding forward at a frustratingly sluggish pace. Finally, on June 24th, 2004, authorities up in British Columbia dropped the hammer, officially slapping him with criminal charges for assault causing bodily harm. Things escalated rapidly when an international arrest warrant hit the wire, turning this from a sports dispute into a legitimate border-crossing crisis. That piece of paper effectively locked him out of the United States entirely, which is an absolute career killer when you consider that nearly all major league rinks are located south of the Canadian border. The global hockey governing body decided to pile on shortly after taking his league ban and expanding it across the entire world. This massive ruling slammed the door on any hopes he had of heading to Europe to play professionally during the impending league-wide labor shutdown, and it completely stripped away his privilege to ever wear the Team Canada jersey in any global tournament. The International Federation did not mince words, officially branding his brutal attack as a massive unpardonable breach of the sport's rules that dragged the game's reputation straight through the mud. Back in the courtroom, his high-priced legal defense team wasted zero time pushing the narrative that this entire ordeal should be handled strictly in-house by the league's own disciplinary committee. They leaned heavily on the age-old argument that whatever chaos unfolds within the rink should stay within the boundaries of the sport entirely outside the jurisdiction of a real-world judge. The prosecutors, on the other hand, were not buying a single word of that argument, keeping their counter-argument remarkably simple and devastatingly clear. They firmly stated that throwing a criminal punch on a sheet of frozen water is just as illegal as throwing it on a city sidewalk. That clash of ideologies became the central battleground for every single legal maneuver that followed. Fast forward to December 22nd, 2004. He strolled straight into a Vancouver courtroom and shocked onlookers by changing his plea to guilty, completely dodging the massive public spectacle of a full trial that had been slated for January of 2005. He was taking the hit for the official charge of assault causing severe bodily harm. But the aftermath of that plea is exactly where traditional law slammed headfirst into a bizarre, messy roadblock that no judge really knew how to navigate. The lead prosecutor for the Crown meticulously walked everyone through the horrific tape frame by frame, detailing the predatory stalking, the vicious grab from behind, and that devastating sucker punch to the back of the head, making it crystal clear to the room that absolutely none of this was just an unfortunate sporting accident. Yet after dropping all that damning evidence, he stunned everyone by simply asking the judge to hand down a highly lenient conditional discharge. The justification for this incredibly soft punishment came down to a razor-thin legal loophole that completely derailed the possibility of true justice. The prosecution admitted they simply could not prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that this specific cheap shot was the sole and direct reason the victim's professional playing days were permanently destroyed. There was a massive frustrating canyon between what every single person with a pair of eyes knew actually happened and the rigid standard of what the legal books required them to explicitly prove. That very gap is what caused a harsh prison sentence to completely evaporate into thin air. Meanwhile, his lawyers used the notoriously violent unwritten code of the league as a convenient bulletproof vest to deflect the blame. They argued that their client did not create this brutal retaliation-based ecosystem out of thin air. He was simply surviving and operating inside a gladiator culture that the league bosses had not only turned a blind eye to, but actively marketed and glorified for literally decades. Legal experts across the country immediately sounded the alarm, pointing out that this remarkably soft ruling was establishing a terrifying new standard in the justice system. It basically telegraphed to the world that an ice rink was a magical bubble where the standard laws of the country somehow didn't apply the same way they would at your local grocery store. Interactive question mid-video. Alright, let's stop right here because I want to hear from you. Do you think Todd Bertuzzi got off too easy, or was the justice system actually right to factor in hockey's unwritten code? Drop your take in the comments right now. This is one of the most debated moments in sports history, and your opinion matters. Let's keep going. When the gavel finally came down, the punishment was a complete joke to a lot of fans. Just a conditional discharge paired with a single year of probation and 80 measly hours of community service. He walked away with zero time behind bars and an absolutely spotless criminal record. As for his professional penalty, the league benched him for 13 regular season matchups along with an additional 7 postseason games. That added up to a grand total of 20 missed games, which actually registered as the 4th longest ban in franchise history at the time, dragging out over 17 excruciating months thanks to the labor stoppage. He also had to cough up $51,926.39 of his paycheck, while kissing roughly $350,000 in lost sponsorship deals completely goodbye. It was a bitter pill to swallow when you realize one guy had his entire life flipped upside down, losing his physical health, his livelihood, and his childhood dream all in his rookie campaign. Meanwhile, the guy who threw the punch literally strolled right out of the courthouse that very same afternoon without so much as a permanent blemish on his legal background check. The state's attempt at prosecuting the crime had officially reached its disappointing conclusion. However, the multi-million-dollar civil warfare was just getting warmed up in the background. This is the exact moment where the terrifying rumor about a locker room bounty being placed on Moore's head finally got dragged into the harsh light of a courtroom. The injured rookie struck first, launching a massive lawsuit down in Colorado back in February of 2005. But an American judge swiftly tossed the entire complaint out the window, brutally declaring that this on-ice disaster needed to be sorted out north of the border by the Canadian justice system. Let's flash forward to February 16th, 2006. Ironically, this was the exact same day Todd Bertuzzi was lacing up his skates for his very first Olympic appearance with Team Canada. But back home, Steve Moore was making his own moves, officially filing a massive civil lawsuit in the Ontario Superior Court. The hit list of defendants read like a who's who of Vancouver hockey Bertuzzi. Veteran enforcer Brad May, fiery general manager Brian Burke, and the entire Vancouver Canucks franchise, and even the massive corporate ownership group holding the purse strings Orca Bay Sports and Entertainment. Moore wasn't just looking for an apology, he was out for blood, legally speaking. His lawsuit demanded serious financial compensation for a lifetime of lost NHL paychecks, on top of massive aggravated and punitive damages to punish the sheer brutality of the attack. Even Moore's parents got involved, filing their own separate legal action. They demanded compensation for the psychological nightmare of sitting in their Ontario living room and watching their son's lifelong dream violently extinguished on live television. The legal circus dragged on, and by March of 2008, things got even messier. Former head coach Mark Crawford was dragged into the crosshairs. Why? Because Bertuzzi actually turned on his own coach, filing a third-party claim that essentially threw Crawford directly under the bus. Bertuzzi argued that his NHL contract legally bound him to follow his coach's explicit orders, basically claiming he was just a soldier following commands and demanding that Crawford absorb a massive chunk of whatever financial penalty the judge decided to hand down. The locker room code of silence was officially shattered. It was every man for himself. Naturally, Crawford wasn't about to go down without a fight. His official legal response was to claim that Bertuzzi had gone completely rogue, acting in direct defiance of the coach's orders to get off the ice and head to the bench. Fast forward to December 16th, 2008. In a scene ripped right out of a tense legal drama, Bertuzzi and Moore were finally forced into the same room, sitting face to face for the very first time during a court-mandated mediation session. You can probably guess how that went. The tension was thick enough to cut with a skate blade, and the meeting accomplished absolutely nothing. The real bombshell dropped a few years later in September of 2011. Moore's bulldog of a lawyer, Tim Danson, caught wind of some shady backroom dealings involving Bertuzzi Crawford and the Orca Bay executives. They had apparently gone behind closed doors and hashed out a secret under-the-table agreement to split the financial damages among themselves, completely keeping Moore in the dark. The presiding judge was not amused by that little side hustle and swiftly forced all the dirty details of their secret pact out into the public record. The clock kept ticking, and by July of 2014, the stakes hit astronomical new heights. Moore updated his lawsuit shooting for the moon with a staggering demand of 68 million Canadian dollars. He tacked on an extra 30 million specifically to cover the devastating blow to his post-hockey earning potential. Keep in mind, this man was a Harvard graduate. His legal team argued heavily that the relentless, agonizing years of post-concussion syndrome effectively robbed him of the brain power required to perform at the level his Ivy League diploma should have guaranteed. Pouring his heart out to the Canadian media, Moore didn't hold back. He expressed the gut-wrenching reality of his situation, stating that his entire professional trajectory was stolen from him before he even finished his rookie season. He lamented that no amount of money could ever buy back his time on the ice, or replace the sheer magic of living out a childhood fantasy he had been chasing relentlessly since he was just 2.5 years old, battling every single day just to make it to the grand stage of the National Hockey League. Finally, on August 19, 2014, an agonizing 10 years. 5 months and 11 days after that sickening collision on the Vancouver ice, the endless legal warfare ended with a sudden out-of-court settlement. Bertuzzi's defense team announced that the entire matter was resolved in its totality, securely wrapped up under a strict gag order. The craziest part, this happened just 3 weeks before a massive, highly publicized trial was finally set to kick off. Because they settled at the 11th hour, the biggest, darkest mystery surrounding this entire ugly saga, whether a professional NHL head coach literally ordered a hit on a player, and whether a billion-dollar franchise actively endorsed it, never saw the light of a courtroom. It was permanently swept under the rug, locked away forever behind ironclad non-disclosure agreements and fat settlement checks. For Moore, the physical toll was absolutely brutal. He spent an entire agonizing year trapped in a rigid neck brace just to keep his spine stable. Refusing to quit, he ground through grueling rehabilitation and actually attempted a comeback in the minor leagues, but his battered body simply would not let him do it. He was left to suffer through debilitating head-splitting migraines that plagued his everyday life for nearly 10 solid years. Showing incredible resilience, he pivoted hard. He went back to school, earned a Master of Business Administration degree from Stanford University, and successfully reinvented himself as a force in the venture capital world. But still, when we look back at that fateful night of March 8, 2004, there are glaring, uncomfortable questions that the justice system completely failed to answer. First, was Todd actually acting as a lone wolf? Let's look at the facts. Teammate Brad May had literally gone on record offering a straight-up bounty for whoever took Moore out. And when things got real under the threat of perjury, Bertuzzi swore under oath that during the second intermission, Coach Crawford aggressively tapped Moore's name and jersey number on the whiteboard and delivered a chilling mandate, stating the kid had to pay the ultimate price. To add fuel to the fire, the Canucks' own general manager Dave Nonis actually backed up this wild claim in his own testimony. Of course, Crawford vehemently denied playing the role of a mob boss. The corporate suits upstairs completely washed their hands of it, but if you watch the tape, the sheer mechanics of the attack paint a very different, deeply premeditated picture. It was like a calculated military strike. Matt Cook took the first run at him, Brad May was up next, then Bertuzzi swooped in for the devastating final blow. You don't get a synchronized hit squad like that by accident. That is textbook organized retaliation. Yet when the dust settled, only a single guy in that entire chain of command had to answer to the law. The second glaring question leaves a permanent stain on sports history. Did the legal system completely drop the ball on where to draw the line between a hockey play and a straight-up criminal assault? The actual Crown prosecutor stood up in a court of law and admitted a massive, shocking loophole they supposedly could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Bertuzzi's vicious, cheap shot was the sole legal reason Moore's athletic career was destroyed. Because of that, one hyper-specific technicality in the medical evidence, the justice system essentially handed out a massive legal pass. It resulted in a weak conditional discharge, meaning absolutely zero criminal record for a man who literally broke another player's neck and sent him out of the arena strapped to a gurney, permanently altering the sport of hockey forever. A devastatingly fractured cervical spine. Let that harsh reality sink in for a second. If an ordinary citizen had executed that exact same brutal assault on a freezing sidewalk anywhere in North America, they would be staring down a lengthy stint inside a state penitentiary. So when all the dust finally settled, did the National Hockey League actually clean up its act? Well, league executives certainly tightened up their rulebook, dishing out significantly heavier penalties and introducing a much stricter framework for postseason suspensions. The front office completely rebuilt their entire protocol for traumatic brain injuries, a massive paradigm shift directly sparked by the horrific life-altering trauma that Steve Moore was forced to endure on the ice. Officials were suddenly mandated to drop the hammer relentlessly on those dangerous, cowardly checks delivered straight to a vulnerable player's back. Now, those policy shifts were legitimate steps forward for player safety. However, let's look at the men pulling the strings. Head coach Mark Crawford faced virtually zero permanent consequences, effortlessly landing lucrative coaching positions with the Los Angeles Kings and several other top-tier professional franchises. The Vancouver Canucks organization simply opened their deep pockets quietly, wiring an undisclosed multi-million-dollar settlement out of the public eye and offering up a carefully crafted, soulless corporate apology. But the violently toxic environment that ultimately engineered the horrific events of March 8th, the literal open season declared on a targeted player by vengeful teammates, The deeply disturbing accusations of a calculated locker room hit directly ordered by the head coach himself just minutes before the puck dropped, or the sickening strategy of sending wave after wave of enforcers to hunt down a single guy who had already dropped the gloves and paid his required physical toll earlier in the match. Absolutely none of that deeply ingrained systemic corruption ever faced a judge or a jury. Todd Bertuzzi undeniably took the fall and paid his pound of flesh. Meanwhile, the ruthless, bloodthirsty hockey culture that actively manufactured that catastrophic tragedy skated away completely untouched. The chilling silence following that brutal incident still echoes through the rafters of every major ice rink across the continent today. Let the raw statistics paint the final heartbreaking picture. Todd Bertuzzi went on to lace up his skates for 1,159 professional matchups, scoring 314 goals before hanging up his jersey in 2014. Steve Moore's career violently ended after just 69 games. He was wheeled off that frozen surface, strapped to a rigid backboard at the young age of 25, never to take another professional shift again. Forced to pivot, he bravely forged an entirely new path, earning a prestigious degree from Stanford University, and carving out a highly successful career in the competitive world of venture capital. The man who broke his neck simply served his brief time, strapped his pads back on, and seamlessly resumed his multi-million-dollar athletic career, as if that gruesome night was nothing more than a minor speed bump. The evening of March 8, 2004 will forever remain a dark stain on the sport. One violent collision, two men, and two drastically different realities. If you are searching for the gritty, untold tragedies that the major broadcast networks refuse to show on their primetime highlight reels, you have finally found your home for the absolute unvarnished truth. Closing CTA. And if this story hit different, if it made you think, made you angry, or made you feel something real, then do me a favor, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and tap that notification bell right now, because there are literally dozens of deeply buried, unsettling scandals exactly like this one waiting to be uncovered in our archives. And trust me when I tell you, the details only get more twisted and far more disturbing from this point forward. Don't miss a single one.